All right, and this morning we have Samantha here with us who is a part of Southeast Psych, and I was very lucky to meet her this year at a networking event that we did. I think we kind of hit it off right off the bat, and just in connecting over similar populations that we work with, she did volunteer to do this presentation for us today. I am very appreciative of that. I know, Samantha, you don't see the back end on my end of how many people register, but just this topic alone was one of the most popular ones that people registered for. So it's definitely, I think, a need that parents are asking for of just how to support their children in this specific area. So with that being said, I'm going to hand it over to you, and thank you again for doing this today.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me. Can you see my presentation?
Yes,
Okay.
we can.
Awesome. I'm glad that Nikki joined us again. Hopefully she can hear us okay. But thank you everybody for letting me kind of come and talk about friendship and self-esteem. I work largely with I'd say like adolescents to young adults. And so it's a conversation I'm constantly having, not just in the context of therapy and the work that I do. But just also we know how critical it is for all of our children and just humans in general. So my hope is that you'll leave here with some tangible strategies to support your child. And I it's really like this social development, right? Because that's what's happening with friendship and self-esteem and how they come together. So I want you all to leave here feeling as though you can have some strategies to support them. Just generally, here is what we're going to go over. So we're going to talk a little bit about navigating friendships, kind of the importance of social development. What is it? What are those components? How do they all kind of play a role? Then we're going to go into aspects of self-esteem, just things to consider, and self-esteem, and how do these kind of interact with one another. And then finally, we'll do like the steps moving forward, strategies to support your children. Here's the thing, when I was writing or kind of working on this presentation, I thought to myself, we could do an entire presentation on just friendship and then just self esteem. So stick with me as we kind of go through some of the content. But the hope is that we'll have some good touch points, again, that you can take home and connect with your child. That's really the goal here. So who am I, right? I'm, as Carrie mentioned, Samantha Martinez. I'm over at Southeast Psych. I'm currently in my final kind of licensure piece, so graduated and all of that fun stuff, but finishing licensure. So that's why I'm called a postdoc. And so here at Southeast Psych, I do testing and see individual clients. So if any of, kiddos that come in with any ADHD potential concerns or autism or learning disabilities, I do a lot of testing for that. And then I also provide therapy for ages about like 8 or 9 until 55, which has been great. Last year, I was actually at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine, where I was on a pediatric rotation. I just say that because I haven't been in Charlotte all that long. However, I was in Charlotte as a Queens alum. I'm a Queens alum, so I went to Queens for undergrad. So I'm happy to be back in Charlotte, but a lot has changed. So that's what I'm learning, that even where to live and where to go. So that's been nice. Okay, so I wanted actually to start the presentation with a story about a girl named Layla. And so I'm actually going to bring you back to when Layla was in the first grade. So Layla was a first grader at a new school. The school that she was attending, actually, most of the kids knew each other from the previous years. And oftentimes we think like, well, first grade, like that's still really early on in school, right? There's a lot of opportunity. But what can happen sometimes at a new school is that if they already know each other, it can be hard to kind of enter into these kind of social groups or these friend groups. And Layla was noticing that a lot of the students that she was going to school with had already known each other in preschool and kindergarten. And many of them had been living on the same block, so they had biked together, right? So they had lots of things to talk about on that first day of school. And Layla spent weeks kind of sitting by herself at lunch, and she was watching other people, and she was just kind of seeing how all the other kids were interacting. And But Layla was really shy. Like she wasn't sure how to interact. She didn't know what to say. But she started noticing in the first couple weeks of school that there was this table where another little girl had this flip flop lunchbox, right? And she kept noticing it. And I was like, man, I really like that. And then now I'm looking at the lunchbox and I'm now looking at all of these friends and how they interact. And so Layla would go home to her mom and talk about school, and her mom would ask her if she's made any friends yet. And she would talk about how nervous she was and she didn't want to talk to anybody because they seemed like they already knew each other. And and talking with her mom, she brought up the flip flop lunchbox. Like, this girl has this. I really want it. And her mom was just saying, like, well, what would happen if you talked to her about her flip flop lunchbox? And Layla's like, no, I can't do that. I don't want to bring that up. So I'm going to sit at the table. So she continues for about 2 months where she sits by herself. When she goes to recess, she's also kind of playing by herself. When finally it hits her, she's been sitting there for too long. She goes, you know what? Maybe I can say something. And so what she does is she goes up to the table to the little girl and she says, hey, I really like your flip flop lunchbox. I've noticed it. And as she says it, to her surprise, the little girl kind of scoots over and has Layla sit down. And they're talking about this flip flop lunchbox. And after kind of talking about the colors or which flip flop they like the most, the bell rings. And then when the bell rings and they go to recess, Layla starts heading for the corner where she usually sits at recess. Only this time the little girl is still talking with her and kind of brings her along to keep playing, right? So it just happens so organically, like, hey, just come and play. And then what ends up happening is for years, this girl and the flip flop lunchbox friend, just create this friendship that goes on where they get to connect, right? And they play at recess together. And the reason I tell you this story is because when I was 25, Layla told me about this story. This is my best friend. I had no idea about her having this moment. I forgot about my flip flop lunchbox, right? I didn't even think about it. And she had written a letter and she goes, I don't know if you ever realized, but it took me months. And the reason I came up to you was because you had this flip flop lunchbox. And I say that because one, the story shows how important that social connection is, right? She was at school and yearning for that, trying to figure out. However, her confidence or her shyness, she wasn't sure. But she found one thing, right? One way to kind of connect socially. And when talking with her parent, she was able to then come up with an idea. What if you bring up that flip flop lunchbox? And in this particular situation, right, it worked out. And sometimes we have to try different of these like flip flop lunchbox moments, and it may not become a 20 plus year friendship. But in this case, it was. And I just think this is a good memory. And we'll get to the end about how to kind of create these flip flop lunchbox moments. But I just think it's a really special way to think about. Sometimes we just need that one thing and one way to help our kids connect and get that social belongingness. Okay, so why does this matter, what we're talking about? So here's like our hierarchy of needs, right? And many of you have maybe seen this Maslow hierarchy of needs, but what does it start with? So it starts with that physiological need where we need air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, right? All the things you as parents are working so diligently to ensure that your children have, right? But as we go up, take a look at that yellow part of Maslow's hierarchy of need, that love and belongingness. So I think of Layla, right? She was seeking that sense of connection. And then you go up to that next part, it's esteem, self esteem, right? Status, recognition, strength. So then in that same moment, we need these parts, right, of our Maslow's hierarchy of needs. These are needs that human beings have. And Layla in that story was trying to find it. I'm trying to find belongingness while I'm navigating my own self esteem. And so we know for your kiddos, this is critical for them as well. It's also critical for you, right, as parents, of having love and belongingness and self esteem. And so today we're going to talk specifically about those two parts, right? That yellow and green section of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But what contributes to social development? So we can talk about hey, these are some strategies, but we need to kind of think about these larger concepts of like what kind of goes into social development so that we can then build friendship. So things that we might consider are culture, right? How is the cultural landscape changing? Not only just like culture within society, but culture within your home. I grew up in a Cuban family, right? So culture in our home was everything was centered around food. That's how we invited people over. That's how I knew, to get friends over. Now as an adult, I can make my own food, right? And that's how a lot of how I invite friendship. I'm like, oh, I'm going to make a meal and people come over. So your culture influences your social connection. Language. Uh, Language now looks very different than maybe language even looked when I was a kid, right? We have phones. So language is also in texting language or verbal language or our nonverbal language. So this all contributes to our social development. And then, of course, those social interactions. What types of social interactions? How much access do I have to social interaction? And what you probably are thinking as I go through culture, language, and social interaction, because I do the same thing, is how different our culture, language, and social interaction is today in comparison, like I said, to when we were maybe younger, especially with online and in person interactions. And there are many things that kind of contribute to that, right? Whether it be the pandemic and how it shifted our narrative, or kind of the increase of phone uses and electronics. But it's important for us to be aware that all of that is contributing to our children being able to make friends and to keep friends. So here's what I think about. When I was, a kid, and whether it's elementary school or middle school or high school, this is what friendship looked like to me, right? So maybe it started with Bert and Ernie and they had this friendship, and I was a Sesame Street kid. I know that we've changed to Bluey for many of our kids, right? So um, that's where I saw friendship. So Bert and Ernie, the way they interacted, Bert often got frustrated, Ernie often tried to fix that, right? So they had kind of this friendship that we saw on screen. And then as you get a little bit older, it's like, oh, there's these friends characters. And then you start to see, okay, so Bert and Ernie are, two somewhat presenting like male Muppets, right? And then we get into our friends and it's like, oh, okay, we have girls and guys kind of becoming friends and how they interact and the struggles they have. And then I love Clueless, and so I think about their interaction with Cher and just having friendship. This is what friendship looked like. Only now we know that friendship and, like I said, culture and language and social interaction looks different. So I want you to think, and so I brought up maybe the areas of my life where friendship most stood out to me, but I'm curious, like, what about your own culture, language, social interaction, views of friendship is different than your child's current experience? Like, what are some things that you're noticing? Like, we are just so different in the way that this shows up. Like, my child's not watching Sesame Street, so that's not how they're seeing friendship. Or they're on YouTube all the time versus actually watching a TV show. So, I'd love for you either to unmute yourself if you're comfortable or type something in the chat. When you think about some of these areas, the culture, language, and these social interactions, how did your experience differ than your child's current experience? If anyone's brave enough.
I think you already tapped on this, the idea of how much social interaction now is centered on that like electronic connection rather than like when I was a kid, I was, riding bikes around the neighborhood and doing things like that. And I think that's just very different. And somebody put in chat that she said, definitely YouTube is a new experience for all of my kids ages 3 through 12.
Yeah, absolutely. So like we're kind of changing the way I love, and it often comes up when I talk about like how does social interaction change, is that like internet kind of focus of YouTube and what YouTube looks like. I mean, I remember YouTube as like you look up, maybe music videos, or somebody had put up a song with lyrics that they had typed out behind like the scene of a waterfall. That's what I remember YouTube being. And now, like I think the ages that you had mentioned, right? 3 to 12. So it's expansive. Like everybody, all ages are kind of using YouTube, but they're like watching people do things. Like that's a big, right? Like watching people open something or watching people go on a trip or what. And so it's kind of just changing our landscape. And while we can sometimes want to push against it, and there are going to be some areas, and when we get into social development, we can talk about some areas to grow, it's also leaning into it. Like, how can this, if I understand this a little bit more, how can that help me understand my child versus like maybe an argument that comes up? That doesn't mean that we can't have expectations. Yes, run over things. I know they're watching so many things, creating slime, right? Which that maybe just helps us because then we can learn how to create slime ourselves. But yeah, it's definitely different, but we want to kind of learn, okay, my culture, language, social interaction might be different than my child's, right? As much as I want to push against it, how can I kind of accept it, lean into it to help them grow within this new social world? And the social world is constantly evolving and changing, especially with our electronics. So let's just go over, like I had mentioned, we're going to go through kind of social development and friendship as well as the self esteem. So let's start with social development. So this refers to a process in which an individual learns to interact with others and the ability to create meaningful relationships. So here are some key terms: process. So maybe some of you are in the middle of this process, right? That it's like really, we're trying to figure out friendship, we're navigating this, and then it's the ability to then create those meaningful relationships. So it doesn't mean that it just happens right away, right? So I think about the story with my friend Layla, like there was a kind of a process to that. There were several weeks, there were months even that where they were trying to figure out she was trying to figure out how can I interact, talking with her mom about what she was seeing to be able to then create a meaningful relationship, and for us a lifelong friendship. So here are some major components, and for the purpose of this presentation, because we're going to also go over self-esteem, I'm going to kind of briefly go over these points, but I think they're important to then make our connection of how do we help our children move forward, right? How do we actually support? So these are the major components of social development. So first, the development of relationship. And that starts with caregivers, right? So that development of relationship, kind of learning about relationship. And again, social development, this is kind of the 6 areas that ebb and flow and change throughout our life, like our lifespan, right? So we kind of start once we're born, all of these areas are kind of in play. They're just kind of changing as we get older. And so I'm going to speak about them generally just because it seems like we have individuals with 3 to 12 right at home. Some of you might have adolescents or younger elementary, but all of these components are important no matter your age. So the development of relationships starts with just trying to figure out what happens when I go up to people and I talk to them, or if I wave, right? Like, what does this nonverbal do? Does somebody want to come up to me? Oftentimes, our development of relationships within the school context happens at recess or in these unstructured activities or in the lunchroom, like it did with Layla. Another part of social development is really critical is emotion identification. And oftentimes we think like, oh, that's just helping us regulate, and we'll get into that. But we need to help our children be able to identify emotion so that they can know how to engage socially. Okay, so if I go up to mom and she has this face, right? Like if she's like, her eyebrows are maybe kind of touching each other almost, and her face is kind of scrunched up. What does that mean? If I start to learn that, okay, that might mean angry, then I know how to interact with other people, right? So when I go to make a friend, I might say, okay, they look a little bit angry right now. This might not be a time to extend play, right? This might be a time to wait. So now I can identify that. Or look, that person looks really happy. I know what happy is. I can identify that. This might be a great opportunity to go up and engage with them. Then we have the exploration of their environment. And this one can be hard as parents. I think just in general of letting our children kind of explore their environment in a safe way. So, and we'll talk through that as it relates to self-esteem too, but just the opportunity to go and try and it not always work out, or just learn from my environment. I love this picture of this son and mom, just because many of you might remember putting your children's feet on sand or grass, right, and noticing how their feet, like, we're like, wait, what is this, right? They're kind of exploring their environment. It's the same thing with friendship and socially. I need to kind of explore the recess field, or I need to explore the cafeteria and figure out what's happening in my environment to see, are these friends that I want to connect with? And we'll talk about how to help them do that. Emotion regulation kind of ties in with the identification, right? But oftentimes our kids, they're going through these waves of moods all day long. I'm sure many of you pick up your child after school and you say, what'd you do? I don't know. Right? I don't know what I did. Well, you were there all day. What do you mean you don't know? Or what happened? But because all day long these up and down is happening for them. And for many of our kiddos, they can regulate themselves, right? Eventually they're able to learn skills, but also there are many of our kiddos who can't, and that's really a challenge. And so, how can we support them to regulate? And that might be because, a neurodivergent brain, right? Especially things like ADHD, when we think about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, you think about the brain isn't allowing ourselves to regulate as much, but it's important because I need to regulate myself to be able to engage with friendship. So let's think I'm on the recess field, and we both want to play with this ball for four corners, right? And I'm getting mad because they want it, but if I throw the ball at that person because I'm mad, then I'm not able to have a friendship. I can't engage. What happens if I take a breath, I take a step away, I give them the ball and say, okay, you can play for 5 minutes and then I'm going to play for 5 minutes. Like, we want to help our children be able to engage in that. That's how emotion regulation shows up with social development. Social communication, just briefly, is all of the things that we just kind of talked about, those verbals, nonverbals, the electronic communication, which is often written, visual communication, which also can be in pictures. And so we want to help our children understand and learn about all of the different kind of aspects of social communication. So they may want to be in the written world and do a lot of texting and posting, but it's also important for them to engage in the nonverbal and the verbal aspects of communication. And we'll talk about how to support them. Another part of social development that is critical is adaptive functioning, which is really kind of your child gaining independence to be able to do things on their own. This is so critical when building friendship of, can they do things without you there, right? And it starts with things like brushing teeth and tying their shoes and brushing their hair. But then it also kind of can lean into ordering at a restaurant, right? Or being able to open the door for somebody. All of these aspects are also part of their social development and help them with gaining a deeper connection and friendship, which is everything that we're kind of talking about here. Okay, so I told you I was going to be kind of quick on these areas. So let's just jump into self-esteem. So that's our that's kind of that social development. These are the areas that are critical to kind of building the foundations of friendship. What's self-esteem? Well, the literature often quotes Rosenberg, right, which is from 1965. I think that's just so critical. Like, this concept has been around for a really long time. And I highlight here, this is favorable or unfavorable, right? Evaluation of the self. And so this is like just kind of evaluating yourself. And it may be for favorable and may be unfavorable. And maybe some of your children you're thinking about right now, oh, they have a really favorable self-esteem. They evaluate themselves in a positive way. Maybe some of you are saying, oh, it's unfavorable. Actually, I noticed that my child is really hard on themselves. But this is self-esteem. It's neither. And that's why you might hear about like good self-esteem or bad self-esteem, because that's kind of what we're talking about, of just this favorable or unfavorable. So there are a lot of aspects of self-esteem. I want to talk about a few. And then we're going to talk about, again, how that interplay between friendship, social development, and self-esteem, how they kind of play a part. And then again, let's get to our strategies moving forward. So uncovering values. So a big part of self-esteem is having your child or us as individuals kind of uncovering their values. And I use the term values versus goals. So sometimes goals can be I succeed or I fail. And that can be really hard, because if I think I fail, if my goal is to get all A's, right, and then I get a B, then I automatically think I fail. Or if my goal is to pass classes and I get a C and then I get a D, then I think I fail, right? And grades can often be like this success versus failure. But the value might be learning. Like, I value the learning experience. And so then that offers a different question for your child's self-esteem. So if you sit with them and say, okay, so, it seems like you really care and value school. What parts of school do you like? Well, I really actually value the learning. I love learning. I love sitting in, or I love sitting in my history class and I like learning. Or I really like art. I love how creative it is. I like to be creative and I like to draw. Or I really like the social part. I like connecting with my friends and my community. And like, they're always wanting to go to the John Crosland events, right? Like, that's what they like about school. then you can have a different type of conversation with them, right? So if they come home and say, I'm the worst at school, I don't know how to do it. Well, remember, a big part of school for you is learning. And do you feel like you're learning some things? What did you learn? Right? We can kind of shift the conversation with them. So that's where I focus on the value kind of versus like these goals. Another aspect of self esteem is learning how to trust. There's two components of this, right? Not only learning how to trust others, so that happens from birth. Who's going to feed me? Right? Who's going to change me? We know that this trust is building in terms of self esteem, but also how can I learn to trust myself? So I talk a lot about this with our adolescents around learning that gut response, right? So we know that we have these physiological connections between brain and body, right? So we know that that's happening. So this is in the aspects of self-esteem. They're learning how to make that connection and to rely on that to help them understand, like, okay, what's best for me in this situation. So helping your child make that connection. Hey, do you notice if your belly gets butterflies when you're nervous? Yeah, that's sometimes your belly telling you that you're a little bit nervous. When that happens, what can you do? That's where we get into that self regulation that we're talking about with social development. Hey, did you notice when you were talking to that friend that your shoulders were getting tighter? Yeah, okay, so trust your body. Maybe that was not a good situation. Maybe it's good to walk away. So, this is where we can help facilitate a lot of this. Becoming responsible, right? So, this is our children being able to gain new skills or whether it's connecting with other people or just getting new responsibilities at home. This is kind of that independence, getting them opportunity to do things on their own. And then acceptance. And again, what I'm talking about here is a lot of ways that we can support our or lots of aspects of self-esteem. And again, we're going to talk about how to support, because this isn't, while this happens organically, people are constantly, having favorable or unfavorable kind of thoughts about themselves. Like, that self evaluation is going to happen. We also kind of want to help support our children and intervene so they become more aware of this. And so that's where I say with acceptance, this is hard for us as adults of like accepting the moment, right? But what acceptance allows is, again, we're not constantly evaluating on this good or bad, right? Best or worst. We have a lot of that thought process, and it's because a lot of what we talk about in life is I'm successful or I'm a failure, but sometimes it just is, right? And so that's where we can help our child kind of come to that present moment of like, well, what's just happening right now? And it's okay for it to be hard or it's okay to be uncomfortable, but that doesn't make you good or bad or best or worst. And so we'll talk a little bit about how to kind of help them, how to help them get to that acceptance piece. So how does this all play a role? So I love this, like, what came first? Friendship or self-esteem? Well, the literature will argue about it, and we'll talk a little bit just to give us some insight of like what came first, the chicken or the egg. So some will say social relationships shape self-esteem. So a lot of the literature kind of points to, well, self-esteem fluctuates with the level of approval from others. Maybe some of you are sitting here going, yeah, I think about when I'm at work. If I'm not feeling great about my self-esteem or I'm self-evaluating, I'm not feeling like I'm doing a good job at work, but then my boss says, hey, great job. You notice, oh, wait, I am doing a great job, right? So we notice that there's that interplay. So the researchers who think social relationships shape self-esteem will say self-esteem kind of fluctuates with the level of approval. Also, this perceived appraisal from others is shaping our self-perception. Many of you might be having children coming home, well, I think they're talking about me, or they don't like me, or the way that they looked at me, right? So even if somebody doesn't do something, if we perceive it, right, to be as such, maybe they'll say like, oh, my teacher doesn't like me. Even if the teacher didn't come out and say, I don't like you, right? They just kind of make there's this perception that can then shape how they feel about themselves. So kind of bringing that awareness to them, like, oh, wait, we really want to kind of focus on how we think people are thinking about us, but we don't actually know. Relationships kind of suggest worthiness. So if I have lots of friends, then that can impact our self-esteem. And if I feel like I'm worthy, relationships kind of bonds that quality influence on self-esteem. So if I have a quality friendship, even if it's not plentiful, I don't have hundreds of friends, but I have one quality friendship, the literature kind of suggests that influence self-esteem. And then also, There's a lot that goes along with attachment theory, which maybe some of you have heard of previously, but just around that relationship security starting with caregivers. Like, do I feel secure in this relationship? And that later impacting your child's ability to kind of form those social connections. So when you read this, you're like, oh yeah, okay, this came first, right? The egg came first. So social relationships shape self-esteem. But then we have this other side of the literature that kind of says, well, what about the chicken? Okay, so self-esteem shapes social relationships. So on the flip side, we have literature that's saying, well, self-esteem affects perception of the relationship and within that partnership, right? So that's actually, if I feel positively about myself, then I perceive the relationship as positive, right? Or if I self-evaluate and I think unfavorably about myself, then I might think that relationship is negative. Um, Also, we see that low perceived kind of regard. So if I have this unfavorable view of myself and my self-esteem and my values and my responsibility and acceptance of who I am, if I have low regard, then I distance myself socially, right? And I kind of avoid vulnerability. So if I am unsure of how I regulate my emotions, right, then I might not go and connect with other people because I'm afraid what might happen. So I just completely avoid friendship. Also, it says that, like, okay, well, self-esteem kind of determines your success in forming connections, saying that you will be more successful if your self-esteem of yourself is more favorable, versus kind of this negative effect, kind of prompting behavior to resolve conflict and improve those relationships. So, like, if I have this negative affect, right, it's going to kind of change this behavior to resolve conflict and improve the relationships. I'm not doing so well. I can see how I'm showing up with self esteem. So now I need to fix my relationships that I may have broken. So after I go through this part of the literature, you might be saying, okay, well, now, yeah, the chicken came first, right? I think what's important, regardless of if we have this conversation of, uh, whether it was the chicken, whether it was the egg, right? What I think is most important is helping our children find that flip flop lunchbox moment. Because I think what happens so clearly in the example that I described with Layla, right, in that first grade moment, is there was a lot happening for her of, okay, I'm noticing my self-esteem, I'm shy, I'm worried, I'm giving kind of several weeks of that. And even in those moments of, like, I'm uncertain, I'm feeling unfavorable towards myself. And also, but I want to kind of engage socially. So what can I do? Layla describes that, that experience was really uncomfortable. Like, when we talked about it, I was like, oh, I didn't even know about the flip flop lunchbox moment. But yeah, it was uncomfortable, but kind of pushing through that discomfort to be able to make the connection allowed for the friendship to happen. So, how can we help our children create these flip flop lunchbox moments rather than just saying, go find a flip flop lunchbox, right? But what can we actually do to kind of support them? So let's start with the first one. First is helping and learning your child's language and style of communication. So this is where I go back to. If we lean into, well, Bert and Ernie, this is what they do. Your child's gonna be like, I don't know who Bert and Ernie is. Or maybe they do. Maybe they're watching Sesame Street. But maybe it's Bluey, right? Maybe you're talking about Bluey and you're now learning that that's their style of communication, right? So back in my day, we did this. I know we can lean on that a lot. Instead, when we do that, it can often make your child feel unfavorable. Well, I'm doing something wrong. This was easy for mom. This was easy for dad. This was easy for caregiver, right? So instead, let me learn my child's language and their style of communication to uplift that. Maybe you're an outgoing parent with a shy child. How do they communicate best with people? What might they say, right? Because if you say, well, just go up to them, say, I like your lunchbox, right? It might take some time. So, what could we do? All right, first, let's just wave. Maybe nonverbal communication is better. Or maybe you could ask for their telephone number so that you could send them a text message. So, we want to kind of get creative. So, if we learn how our child communicates and what style of communication works best for them, then we can uplift that first in hopes that it kind of increases the self-esteem and then increases the ability for them to kind of develop those relationships, right? Now, once we do that, once we uplift, and again, chicken or egg, right? We can have that conversation. But once we uplift, then we can help them get uncomfortable. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But once I learn and I can help support what's already working for them, then I can help kind of figure out, all right, how can we get a little bit uncomfortable and what strategies can we use to support them? The next thing is modeling this emotion identification and regulation. So, how are you as parents, and I know it puts the onus on us as parents, right? How can we model emotion identification and regulation for our children so that when they go out into the social world and they go to build friendship, that they can do it successfully? And it doesn't mean that once they do it, if a child doesn't reciprocate, that means that they're less than, but that they at least understand. So how can we model emotion identification? Well, one is calling out how we're feeling. Whew, mom was frustrated today. I had a long day at work. I was frustrated. Or I'm kind of confused. Help me understand, right? So we kind of want to just like identify emotions. I mentioned at the beginning of this, I grew up in a Cuban household. In a Cuban household, everything is fine, right? But fine isn't an emotion. As much I learned that, I was like, huh. I went to grad school and I was like, oh, fine's not even on that emotion chart. That was the only emotion I ever talked about at home. And so, can we help our children kind of expand their emotion understanding and identification so that when they go into these friendships, that they know, okay, maybe they're confused, right? They're not just fine, or they don't want to be my friend. Maybe they're a little bit confused or they're uncertain, so I can engage differently. Also, the modeling regulation. So we have to regulate ourselves too as adults. I keep using examples from either work, but also work, or when you're kind of out doing chores in the community, right? You might kind of get dysregulated. I sometimes get dysregulated in traffic, right? So that might be my Jersey driver in me. But, if I model regulation, okay, I'm going to put on my favorite song during traffic. That's going to help me kind of calm my body down. I'm going to take some deep breaths, right? All of this helps your child see, oh, this is how you regulate. So when I get on on the playground, then if somebody is on the monkey bars and I want to be on the monkey bars, even though I might want to push them off, right? Because I'm angry and I think that's what I would be the best thing. Oh, wait, hold on. Let me take a deep breath, right? Let me walk away and come back. How can I calm my body down to ask, like, hey, when are you getting off the monkey bars versus I'm going to push you? So we want to help model that so that they can then create those lasting relationships. If I can then ask, can you get off the monkey bars? Then maybe I then can have a conversation and have a friend versus if I push a kid off the monkey bars, then I lose access to a potential friendship. This is really one that is so important. And I'm going to use a work example, but just think about how many times you've had to do a presentation like this, right? I didn't come into this presentation and say, all right, I'm just going to do it, right? And here it goes off the whim. I practice during low stakes. I often practice in the mirror, or I sit at a table and I'll say a story out loud and then I'll redo it. Same thing with our children. How can we practice during low stakes? So I go back to Layla's story. Hey, what happens if you call out the flip flop lunchbox? What would that sound like? Well, just saying, hey, I like your lunchbox. Practicing this at home helps our children it not be the first time they do it, right? So if they're feeling unfavorable about themselves, or they're having this kind of low self-esteem moment, or they're nervous, which is expected to make friendships, if at home we say, okay, what would it sound like? It sounds like you really want to be friends with Layla, right? It seems like somebody you want to be friends with in your class. What could you do? Well, I noticed that she wears a Star Wars shirt, right? Or I notice he always has a truck in his backpack. Or I really like his water bottle, right? I feel like water bottles have become so popular, right? Like if they have the Stanley, right? Or like, or what's their sticker on their water bottle? Practicing this with you as their parent, and it's going to feel so awkward, and they might feel like it's silly, right? Oh, I don't know. That sounds weird, mom. Or I've had clients in session say, I don't know. That's not how a middle schooler would say it. I'm like, great. How would a middle schooler say it? What would that sound like? And you'll be surprised how many people leave, at least in this therapy session, going, that was a lot easier than I expected, right? That sounds better. I didn't even think I could say that, or I didn't realize that that's what I was trying to say. And so if we practice during low stakes, then once they get there and that anxiety may rise, or they might get nervous, or they're uncertain, and their self-esteem starts showing up around how do I feel about myself, they can say, oh, I've practiced this. I know what it sounds like to do it. And it can help them engage. So you guys can practice in your car, like, what greetings might sound, what some of the greetings might sound like, or if they want to invite somebody over, what the text message might look like, right? Or, kind of practicing together in these low stakes environments is a really great way to kind of help alleviate some of the anxiety that can come up. This is another one. Again, this is you all working together. Just like self-esteem and friendship kind of plays a role together, you all can work together to kind of create goals related to friendship and even their self-esteem. So uh, oftentimes I use the first of the year just because we use it as a resolution, but it's okay to do this whenever. Like, hey, I've been noticing you talking about you want to make some friends in the fourth grade, right? Or you've been thinking about what happens when school ends because you don't have people's numbers, right? And it's going to be summertime and you might want to hang out with them and they live in different parts of the city. So together you can sit down and create some of these goals of building friendship and self-esteem. This also could be a time where you talk about those values. So maybe you have some specific goals that they want. So the goal would be to meet a new friend or to get a friend's uh, number for the summer, right? And we can also sit and talk about the values. What's important to you in those friendships? What do you value in friendships? Well, maybe I value somebody who can talk to me. And again, in the second grade, they might value somebody who can talk about American Girl dolls, right? That's something that's really of value for them. So they want to find that. So the goal might be to then find a friend who talks about American Girl dolls, right? So we can kind of sit down together and create these goals to then help increase the areas of self-esteem to make this a little bit easier for them to kind of engage in. Another part that you can play is kind of help facilitating that social interaction and friendship. And so sometimes I've said this, and parents are like, well, I try. I'm like, well, invite anybody over. They can all come over. Sometimes that can feel really vague and big. So it can be helpful to say, it sounds like you've been really wanting to go to a movie. One of those goals that you said was that you wanted to meet a new friend. Why don't we invite somebody to come to the movie? And then we tie it in. What would that sound like to invite them to come to the movie, right? So then we're kind of bringing this all together and then they're going to school. Could you write it down? Could you send a text message? We're learning their language and their style of communication. But it helps us, if we can help them facilitate that social interaction, right? Then we can increase that friendship and we can also help with their self-esteem, which may be feeling unfavorable, but then we can hopefully increase it as they practice and try. Sorry, I'm clicking back and forth here. So I end with this just because I think oftentimes as parents, there's a lot of onus on us, right? Like okay, I need to do all of this. And what happens if I'm navigating my own self-esteem and my own friendship and trying to figure out the social world? So you have wonderful counselors at your schools, right? Like at John Crosland, like you can go and talk specifically with counselors and say, hey, I feel like I'm going to use Layla. Layla's coming home every day and she's saying that she hasn't met anybody. Are you noticing what's going on in the lunchroom or what's happening in the classroom, right? So lean on your counselors or your teachers, but you can also get additional support in the community and have them help support. Maybe you're saying, well, my child, they don't listen to me. I've tried these ideas and I don't know what's going on. Maybe find somebody that they feel connected with or that they could have these conversations openly so that they can start to figure out how can I build friendship and how can I increase my self-esteem. So just know you're not alone, right? I love the it takes a village kind of notion, but it really takes community to help support our kiddos. So lean into your school support or your community support and kind of get additional help. Other things with additional help may include extracurricular activities. Hey, you've been saying you like field hockey. Let's go play in the field hockey, or let's go do a social skills group, or let's go to camp if those are things that are accessible to you. If you belong to a church, let's start going to youth group. Those would be included in getting additional support, right? So it's like, let me get additional support than just what we're doing at home. That's also facilitating. That's also listening to their language and communication. It's just then getting additional support for you as the parent. So I know that we're going to be able to pause. I know that was a lot of content, so I appreciate you sticking with me. But that take-home message that I hope kind of leaves here is we can support these lunchbox, right, moments, these flip-flop lunchbox moments, whether it's them complimenting something about somebody or giving a nonverbal or sending a text message. Like we as parents can kind of help, and we know how critical it is because we know the role that friendship and self-esteem are playing. Again, whether chicken or the egg, they're playing a role, and they're definitely kind of interacting. And so because there's interactions, right, let's just help and support our kiddos. And hopefully some of these tangible examples are things that you can take home. And maybe it just starts with a question when you get home today and they're in the car, just asking about their friends in general. Who are they naming? Who are they pointing out? And just kind of starting there. So thanks so much. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can maybe have some conversation and questions if you have any.
Samantha, thank you so much. That was a ton of really valuable information. So thank you. I am going to stop the recording now. So if you do want to unmute and ask questions, you feel like it's a safe place to do so. But thank you so much.
Of course.